Welcome back everyone to another episode of the Build and Learn series in Stanford Bay. Today's actually really exciting because this is an aspect of City Skylines that I really enjoy, and that is designing my skyline. This has become one of those fun and unique sort of activities of when you build a city that can kind of make your city super iconic or interesting. And this is something that I feel pretty passionate about and I really want to discuss with you all. So be sure to hit the subscribe button, leave a like on the video, and drop a comment down below with your thoughts. Now, first and foremost, I'm doing this slightly out of order from what you might normally do. Typically, you're going to want to add services like water, power, and that sort of thing into your city. However, I'm doing it this way for a very specific reason, and that is that to plan my city the way I want, I tend to need to build a few things just to figure out where some of these services can live. I wanted this video to be pretty focused on the skyline itself. So probably next video we'll be diving into services and getting some of these buildings added into our downtown and surrounding area. So our first step here is for me to go through our list of assets in game and start laying out these buildings so that I can see what all we have available to use in our build. As I've mentioned, I'm playing with mods and assets from the Steam Workshop, but with some of the new content creator packs, there's a bunch of new buildings and things like that, including the skyscrapers pack, which gives you the opportunity to really design your skyline the way you want. And I'll be leaning on many vanilla buildings as well as Steam Workshop assets to help create the skyline. Now, we've talked a lot about theme and trying to figure out a purpose for your city in the previous video. And with those things in mind, it's important to be able to select your buildings sort of accordingly, right? So if you're building next to a beach, you may want some condominiums, resorts, you may want a lot of glass buildings. Whereas if you're building somewhere else, maybe you want to focus more on brick buildings or a lot of concrete. It's just kind of up to you and dependent on what style you're picking for your city. So there's a few things I want to focus on for my build, and that is specific to the geographic location, some of the identity that we've already started to build, right? We have beaches and we're going for more of a coastal look. So I'm going to focus on making condominiums and some sort of high-end residential along the coastline on some of these organic lines. And I'm going to focus on putting office buildings a little bit more towards the center. If you're planning on zoning more of this than anything, I'd recommend keeping your high density residential towards the outside with your office space and stuff like that a little bit more centered, kind of following the same template. Now, the buildings I've selected off the Steam Workshop are obviously curated to what I'm looking to build. I feel like this process also helps me figure out what buildings I'm really going to be focused on and using so I can keep my inventory clean, as well as starting to get an idea of how these buildings will be placed in the area. It gives me a visualization that I don't normally have if they're all sitting on a toolbar. While this process may seem messy, I feel like it's faster and more efficient to do it this way versus trying to pick each individual building out and trying to set it up from the menu. So now that you have a wide palette of buildings to choose from, you can start placing them and figuring out how they work together, where they should be placed against each other, what works where. Another thing that I would like to identify is making sure that all these buildings sort of work together in some capacity. I don't want all of the same buildings, but I do want the buildings to sort of complement each other in the way. So while I may want to focus heavily on glass buildings, it would help to have buildings that are primarily concrete or some other texture to help make the glass building stand out even more. Now that I'm setting all these down, there's a few things that I want to identify. One of those things to identify early is to start seeing height. How tall do I think the building should be in this area? What is my peak? I tend to pick 1 to maybe 3 buildings that are really going to be the sort of tentpole, the tallest buildings in the city. I would look at this fairly early because it'll help you determine how to taper off your city in any given direction. This is obviously dependent on what you're looking for or what you're trying to set up, but I think it's very important to sort of find buildings that work a little bit in unison. You don't want anything absurdly high with a bunch of significantly lower buildings unless you're just trying to make something very specific. So for example, if I use a scale, if I see a building that's 100% of the height that I'm looking for, I want several other buildings to be around that 75% mark. That way there's some unity and some consistency across the buildings in the skyline. And as I place these taller buildings, they would typically be centered. They won't be at the very edge. I'll put them somewhere where they can be sort of featured in the middle. Part of this is to create, again, density, also verticality in the city. So I don't want the tallest buildings on the outside and the smaller buildings towards the inside necessarily, except for filler, obviously, but it makes you have to look up into the skyline a little bit, if that makes sense. You're going to see things stacking in terms of the buildings and the depth that you create. Whatever buildings you choose to be the taller buildings in your city, go ahead and get those positioned relatively early. Again, this helps guide a little bit more of the process moving into the next steps. Another big thing that I can identify by laying all these buildings out is starting to figure out how to taper off the buildings from my peak height down into lower buildings as we exit the downtown area. This is what I like to call the fade. Now that fade is created by selecting buildings that can help you transition from the highest point to lower points of your city. So in this particular instance, with us being on a peninsula, we have limited land area to spread out our downtown. So I do want to make it kind of filled and congested with buildings. So everything around our peak buildings should start to taper off, especially towards the borders. Now, given the geographics of this, we don't really have to do crazy tapering around edges of the peninsula on the beach, but towards the highways, we do need to taper off and create a fade from high to low. So as you're laying out all your buildings, you want to look for variations in height. Now, some buildings, including I think some of the skyscraper buildings, even come with variations of height that you can utilize in different areas. Now, we don't really want to use buildings too often. For example, we don't want to repeatedly use buildings unless we can find some ways to integrate them where they aren't as noticeable. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, because I'm going to reuse some buildings, or I'm going to use buildings that are the same, just different heights or scale. This helps minimize how many assets you need from the workshop or how many assets you need to use in general, but also helps create filler space when you have large blocks you need to actually put stuff in. The fade is something that I think is quite significant in creating a realistic looking city. You do want the buildings to sort of fade out. If they abruptly just stop into residential, that sometimes looks a little funky. So take the time and find buildings that you feel like can bridge the gap between tall and shorter buildings all the way down to maybe mixed use type buildings that are much lower to the ground, like 3 to 5 stories tall. That way it's a much easier transition into something like a suburb next to downtown. So let's talk a little bit about placement as we're starting to get these buildings into areas that I think they'll start to fit over time. It's going to take some adjusting. You're going to see me play with several buildings more than once to try to find a home for them. If you're wondering why I keep zooming out after I move like basically every building, it's because I'm looking to sort of fill holes in the skyline. So for example, I don't want every building to just be stacked on top of one another. And this is an important thing too when you're setting up your grid. You want to be able to create certain angles and make your city feel three-dimensional. This is most evident when you start to place buildings down, because you don't want them all stacked where you can't see every building behind another building, like they're just covering each other up. You want them to be slightly offset, so that way it creates this look of density. And you can see that when you sort of zoom out and you level off the camera with the map and you're looking through to see, okay, can I see the hills in the background, or am I seeing another building that's a couple streets back, right? The only times I really want to be able to see straight through all the buildings is if I'm looking down a street. And now some of this is up to preference too. If you want to create more of a spread out downtown, obviously feel free to leave some open areas, whereas my city centers tend to be a little bit more compact. And also, I'm looking at what orientation a lot of these buildings should be on, especially if they have unique sides or angles. I'm trying to find spots for them to fit where they fit the road, or maybe they fit a certain perspective better than others. So for example, if you have a building that just feels like a corner building, like it's got a nice presentation facing one specific corner, you can use that in a corner of a grid, right? Setting up that grid to look a little bit different. This is also significant when you have buildings with curves or different angles that can maybe complement or sort of break up the monotony of just buildings being flat against different roads. Obviously, there's curved buildings and things that can also help with just making it a little more dynamic and interesting than having flat buildings against flat roads in a grid system. Obviously, with how we've planned this city and how we've set it up so far in the previous episodes, you know that we set down a grid and now we're filling it with buildings. You could do it in the reverse order if you would like, where you build around the buildings as you're sort of placing them. However, I sometimes feel like that will tend to lack in terms of consistency across the board. If you're just shaping roads around buildings that you're placing on the fly, it's hard to make it all feel connected at times. While you're sometimes rolling the dice at putting roads down before your buildings, it is an interesting exercise to go back and try to fill that area, and sometimes that just comes with experience of playing cities. As I've already mentioned, I do feel like this area is pretty large, probably larger than I would actually prefer it be, so we could change that later. We could go in and alter it and make it smaller. For now, I'm going to try to fill it the best I can and see sort of where we land. This whole portion of city building is like putting together a puzzle for me. I'm looking for the pieces that fit into the template that I've laid down already. You're trying to find the buildings that fit your skyline, that not only identify with the style that you want, but also fit the space that you've developed. And one thing I've already begun to notice with how I'm placing these buildings is we still have a lot of dead space, and I think there's an opportunity to do something a little bit different that I don't do enough of, which is super simple. I'm going to add some tram lines in here, because what I'm seeing is that my space is still pretty open. There's a lot of dead space in between the buildings, and I want to start to fill up some of that. And I thought one thing I never tend to do is build trams, as simple as that seems. I'm also going to start looking for spaces for green space. You can already tell that I have one rectangular space towards the end of the peninsula in the interior of the buildings that will be a green space area. And then I'm going to find other opportunities to do that. Additionally, I'm going to start reworking the roads a little bit to add some more intersections into some of the grid we've already set down. Now the tram will have a loop around the town and a line through the middle. I think that'll be something interesting that I'm gonna have to play with a little bit, but I think it'll kind of set this apart some and give us a little bit more density in terms of the traffic flowing down the road. I'm I'm also considering that maybe the buildings closer to the end of the peninsula need to be tighter together, whereas as we move past some of the taller buildings and on the backside of the peninsula, we may need to get a little bit shorter in terms of height, a little faster. So that means we're gonna have to condense space a little bit, maybe taper the buildings a little faster, and also find something for the bottom edge of downtown away from the open body of water and on the riverside that might seem a little interesting or neat, that might make this downtown feel a little special. So since I mentioned green space, it's also very helpful to keep in mind that you can add little green pockets, little parks in between some of the buildings, some of the clusters at least, that'll help give your city some variety in terms of what you're going to be detailing later. It's very easy just to lay concrete everywhere. Trust me, I've done it. It's interesting. However, it's also really great to have some green pop in those spaces just to make it seem, I don't know, a little more dynamic. And you also need parks in these spaces, right? So keep that in the back of your mind as you're setting up these buildings. Just think that, hey, maybe I can add some green space here with some organic pathing, maybe a little bit of landscaping and just some trees just to break up the monotony of buildings and concrete. Now, as I'm starting to fine tune some placement, make some adjustments, I think it's really critical to point out that you should be looking at your city from multiple angles. Don't just keep going to the same angle and looking at it and say, it looks good from here. Why is that? Because we talk about some 3D perspective here. It's really critical that you try to get a balance on all sides. It will pay off later when you go to take that really great screenshot. And there's this really cool feeling when you have multiple sides of your downtown all looking sort of connected and interesting and dynamic. That's a really fun feeling to have. It's very easy to continue looking at things from one side and start to lose some of the dimensionality that you're trying to build in. So you can really tell the difference between what I was doing earlier and what I'm doing now, where I'm just moving buildings, just a few centimeters here and there and trying to make sure they're not overlapping some of the road changes I've made. I'm looking at different views to see how the buildings fill the space. What building do I need to turn or shift in a certain way just to take up more of the lines and pathways through some of the buildings so that it all feels, again, very dense and very dynamic and interesting. Ideally, at this point, you're trying to make decisions on, okay, what roads do I need to add? Where can I put some parking garages or parking lots? Where is that green space we talked about? Where's that going to go? How's that going to fit in? And where do we need maybe some pedestrian pathing to really, change up what we're doing in the downtown area? And just like everything else we're doing in this series, don't get discouraged if it's not quite coming together. It's still something you can adapt and change over time. We are laying out the bare bones essentials that we need to create a downtown, right? Which is roads and buildings and some placement of things. And as I'm fine tuning, I'm still trying to figure out if this is going to work in general. I don't know. The city's awfully big compared to what I had in my mind. And I'm already a little bit concerned about, okay, what do I need to do for filler? What kind of buildings do I need to get or find in order to fill up some of the space that I have? Now, I realize at this point, if you are someone that's zoning, you're probably like, how does any of this apply to me? And I don't want you to feel completely left out. There are areas that we are going to zone, especially our suburbs and residential areas, mainly because I think it's a lot easier than trying to detail every house. However, for this particular thing, I think it's much easier for me and just sort of what I'm trying to do to plop down all my main buildings to get them set up the way I want them and to create the vision that I'm trying to create. If you are zoning your downtown, it's going to be a little more difficult, right, to get this sort of look or the look maybe that you're hoping to get. I would really recommend playing with land value, trying to get it up in certain areas to try to get buildings to look appropriate based on what you're going for. Everyone sort of has their direction they're going to go in. Some folks prefer to play vanilla. I like to play heavily modded to sort of medium modded with a decent amount of assets available to me. And as I've said before, I prefer the aesthetic. I like this challenge of designing a city, especially my Skyline. For some reason, this just resonates and is really, really an interesting project for me. Almost every time I start a city, this is something that just captures my attention. So now many of our bigger buildings, our main structures that are going to be really featured in the Skyline are placed. It's time to start working on things like filler and finishing out or fade out, especially on the bottom side of town. So for me, filler are buildings that are maybe less prominent, less featured in terms of what we have in the Skyline. However, they tend to add the density that we want around other more featured buildings. So you could say that you have a bunch of signature buildings that create your Skyline, and then you have filler buildings to take some of the lower space that's just empty out of the equation, right? It's going to fill those empty areas up. They can also be very helpful for creating and finishing off your fade as you move away from downtown. Now, this is where you may need to lean on some of the duplicate buildings you have that come in different heights, right? So again, like I mentioned, skyscrapers, there's some variation in height that you can use to accommodate maybe adding some filler. Just be careful about how you place some of these buildings. You don't want them right next to the building that is their duplicate. Instead, try to bury it within other buildings. So for me, I'll often look and see, okay, how far away are these buildings apart? Are they on opposite ends of the skyline? And I feel like it's pretty safe to use both of them. With some of the DLCs and more recent content creator packs, there's options too for creating some density with other buildings that maybe you wouldn't necessarily consider for downtown. For example, there's many high density commercial buildings that I tend to use in different areas to fill space, especially with some of the recent content creator packs and DLCs. While the game in its sort of vanilla form doesn't necessarily include a lot of mixed use, sometimes we have to extend our imagination a little bit and assume that maybe some of these buildings are sort of mixed use, especially considering that there are multiple stories of commercial. Now, you could argue that some are malls or something like that. Obviously, that's fine. I like to use them just to fill in some of these areas, even though I'm typically leaning towards this idea that they're probably mixed use, right? The upstairs is residential, where the lower floors are typically commercial. And that's just from an aesthetic standpoint, not really a functionality standpoint. Now, something I've tried to improve at over the years is combining buildings. Now, this is sort of an art form within itself, and that's taking buildings that would typically be something placed individually, right? Taking up 4 units or something like that, and then you have a separation, and then you have another 4 units. I try to combine them to make city blocks. As filler, this is a great thing to try and use. It'll take up a little more space. You can create corner buildings. Something to play with and consider, although it is a little bit tricky sometimes to find the right pieces to make it work. Now, there's some buildings on the workshop and in the DLCs and content creator packs that are meant to be combined. They come in a set, and those can be very helpful. If you start learning how to combine buildings and finding out how to make angles or work along the side of a road just to fill in space or just to create unique areas, that can be a really good skill to develop. I will warn though that combining buildings can often result in a little bit of some aesthetically funky stuff happening, right? If you're overlapping buildings, obviously they're not meant to overlap, and without something like procedural objects, I'm tending to do it and letting go of some of the aesthetics. That might be a doubled up wall or a window that looks slightly funky from a very specific angle. I do my best to try to make them look fine. You just may have to decide what your tolerance is for whatever you're designing. In updates to City Skylines, they've also added the ability to put in parking garages, which come in multiple styles that you can switch by clicking on the building. This is a super neat feature that comes with some of the newer buildings in City Skylines, so be sure to check to see if your building has multiple styles options that you can choose from. I'm pretty consistent with adding a lot of parking to downtown areas. It's usually not enough to accommodate the density. However, it's something that I find very important and realistic to have plenty of parking, especially for my North American cities. And in a way, that's a portion of the filler that I'm going to create between a lot of these buildings is parking, green space, and just some park space, whether it's concrete or on grass. Now, with the Steam Workshop, obviously I have a ton of buildings that I can push in my inventory and actually utilize to help with fades, to help create density, filler, whatever that objective is. Sometimes just generic buildings, if you can find generic office buildings, can be wildly helpful for filling these areas up and making your city look more complete. I'd always recommend, if you decide to go to the Steam Workshop route, is to make sure you download stuff that you can sort of keep track of. If it doesn't work in your city or if you don't like it, try to get it out of your inventory as quickly as possible. Inventory management is significant in cities because obviously adding too many assets can cause performance issues. While I'll have my mods and asset list down below, it's critical that you don't just go in and subscribe all. Go through it and use it as a guide to help you choose what you might want in your city. Ultimately, your theme and things like that should reflect in what you're trying to pull from the Steam Workshop, but it's critical that from a game performance perspective, you just don't go downloading everything. Now, we're on the subject of talking about buildings that you can sort of combine or place next to each other to create a continuous unit of buildings. The Brooklyn assets from the Content Creator Pack are also very helpful to create strings of buildings that are apartment complexes, residential to mix in with your commercial and office space. This can be extremely useful to reuse over the course of your city. It's very helpful in areas where you want to create that fade and get closer to more of like a residential housing height, right? Instead of having something so abrupt, you can use these in that intermediate space. You can find buildings like these on the workshop. However, having the Content Creator Pack has also been really useful for me lately because it's been great at filling in certain spaces as well as helping with our fade. And with the ability to switch colors of the buildings, you can match them or create more diversity by changing the colors so that you can reuse the buildings a few times in different areas. This once again gives me added flexibility in being able to utilize buildings multiple times without cluttering up too much in terms of assets in my save files. So ultimately, we have tons to do in this area. Now, I'm not going to finish the filler today. That's going to be something a little bit ongoing along with detailing the city blocks. I'll probably do a video in the near future that'll feature a lot more of trying to fill this space up and make it look as dense as it needs to be to pull off a downtown. but hopefully I've given you some inspiration and some ideas around how to set up your downtown and create a beautiful skyline that is tied to not only what you want to do, but the theme you select. I hope you all enjoyed this episode. Be sure to hit the subscribe button so you can get notifications for when the next episode is out. Also, be sure to leave a like and drop a comment down below with your thoughts. I'm trying to provide updates to the series and weekly uploads, although you can always check the community tab for more information on when videos are going to release. And you'll find the previous video in the series along with the next video once it's available at the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Take care, and I'll see you next time.